everyone. Welcome to the Parmenius podcast with Bernard Wills. I'm your host, Jordan Shepard. Hello, Bernard.
Yeah, hello.
Excellent. Good morning. Today we have our first international guest. Very excited. First international guest. We have Richard Matthews on the podcast. Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Okay, Richard Matthews is an associate professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences and Medicine, Gold Coast, Australia. His research specialization is on violence, ethics, and health. He's the author of The Absolute Violation, Why Torture Must Be Prohibited, Montreal and Kington Press, 2008, as well as articles on torture, social justice, health ethics with Indigenous peoples. Prior to his current position, he worked in Treaty 3 and Robinson Superior Treaty Country, Northwestern Ontario, as a clinical and public health bioethicist specializing in First Nations health ethics. Welcome to the podcast, Richard.
Thank you.
Okay. So what we usually do here, Richard, and our audience, is I make a kind of opening spiel, and then you go. So back when I'll try not to ramble on here. But back when I was a teenager, there was a book called Knots by R.D. Laing, and it was a little set of poems that describe little loops of thought that you can't get out of. Okay. And I think that, since we're talking about peace and, what Rowan Williams, Archbishop, said in his statement in The Guardian, not only does the human race in general seem to be stuck in a kind of loop, okay, but I find I'm stuck in this kind of loop, and I'll cut to the chase. I think the loop can be best described as this, okay? We all see, like, if you're sane, lots of people aren't, but if you're sane, you see, anyone can see the catastrophic consequences of assuming that violence is an ordinary tool of politics. Okay. I know there's like people who disagree with me on that, but that's my position. Okay. Most people, and on many days, myself included, would also add to that, but there's a certain category of things that we might call desperate acts of resistance. Okay? Like what the Ukrainians are doing, right? Or, even, what certain Indigenous people did in order to resist colonial settlers and so on, right? Now, just to start with the Ukraine example. Well, here come the Russians. There's indications in their press and in their public statements that they may have, in fact, genocidal intentions. We can't know that for sure, but there's all kinds of indications in the language they use that Ukrainians are something they want to eliminate as a separate or distinct people. Okay? That kind of threat to people elicits what I would call a desperate act of resistance. But now, if you're going to be effective in your desperate act of resistance, well, damn it, you need those drones from the Americans. And some company has to make that drone. And that company is going to be a major defense company that's going to lobby for war. Okay. So here I am, I'm stuck in a thought loop. And I can't get out of this loop. Richard, get me out of this loop.
I don't know if I can get you out of that loop because, I struggle with that one all the time.
Sure, as we all do, right?
Yeah, as we all do. And in some ways, I think there are ways out of the loop, but the real question is how do you get sort of a society to shift out of it?
Yeah.
Because, the notion of a desperate act of a resistance has its most plausible form at the level of, a radically oppressed individual, in a highly oppressive context, where the conditions of their action are so reduced that, in fact, that they're acting from a genuine necessity. Mm-hmm. And, sort of this is a very, very idealized position in many ways. Sure. So I'm not sure how many people in life actually hit that point. Mm-hmm. Sort of they're usually dead when you're at your point of starvation, you're at the point of having been denied sort of all of the most basic conditions of existence when you reach that element of it, right? And so, desperation cuts in some levels sooner, of course, than that.
Yeah.
But it cuts in before necessity, whatever necessity would be, happens. Now, why does that matter? We like to individualize as a culture, which I think is a mistake.
Yeah.
And so we like to look at it as individual, plucky band of individuals, plucky community, plucky country, under attack. There will always be some kind of empirical evidence in support of that way in which we interpret these things. And we'll use that to kind of generate a legitimating narrative. By the way, I'm going to stay agnostic, about sort of what Ukraine should or should not be doing.
Yeah, and
I just want to talk about the logic of things.
Yeah, I don't want to litigate a particular case here.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. But so what happens is, we onlookers, and that of course includes people on the sidelines who are Ukrainians, but it also includes you and me. Anybody who's opposed or sympathetic, opposed to that Russian invasion, sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause, we get drawn into a very, very dangerous position, which is the one that you've already started alluding to, right? Which is there's no question there's desperation. There's no question there's extreme violence going on, sort of in the current conflict in various ways. But the notion of the desperation of the defender starts to play a legitimating role in our own justification of violence. Mm-hmm. Now, why might that matter? You think standard just war theory, you think the Archbishop's Peace, when he kind of explicitly sort of refers to this. Mm-hmm. As a standard element of just war theory is you should never be attacking, you should be defending unless you're going in on the side of somebody who's just unjustly attacked. When you conceive the violence you're engaging in is justified, though, it has this weird cognitive illusion associated with it, which it stops even looking like violence. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It just becomes, well, that's what has to happen. And this happens in so many different contexts, not just war, the violence of the state in a prison, well, that person did it, so they deserve it. So you have a kind of this moral superstructure, which suddenly gets heaped on top of something, which then licenses, our positive evaluation of war. Well, that's all well and good. This is such a, an obvious and well-known phenomena. But what people forget is, and you've already drawn our attention to this, it doesn't just license our approval of the act of self-defense, or actually really, just the massive, partially coordinated acts of self-defense, which is a war, when you're on the side which has been invaded, but it also requires a whole bunch of other things, which keep getting uglier, as we keep going. One of them is, that you have to start funding the war industries. Who in any conflict like this are the only group of people who unambiguously benefit from it.
Raytheon.
Yeah, Raytheon, the Russian equivalents, there's lots and lots of this, all the ones in the sidelines, Bombardier, the Canadian companies that are building components of these things, and their shareholders, which mostly, of course, are a small number of very, very big players, and then, a few people holding pension funds and the bloody things.
Now, apparently, Richard, I don't know, this in the Department of Small Mercies, I guess the Russian defense industry is not doing well because they get things like electronic chips and ball bearings from the West, right? But, Yeah. But yeah, Lockheed benefits, Raytheon benefits, Bombardier benefits, and so on. Okay?
Yeah.
And so this act of heroic defensive resistance plays into a global infrastructure of war and further deepens our involvement in that quagmire, this global infrastructure of war. Okay.
Yeah.
But I've discussed this question of violence in other contexts, and I've encountered the following argument, which I can't agree with at the end of the day, but I have to say is a powerful argument. Okay. So when there was civil unrest around the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, there were people who were saying the following. Okay. Yeah, Mr. White professor there sitting in your comfy office in Newfoundland, don't preach peace to us because you are preaching from a place of privilege. Okay. Don't preach pacifism to us. Don't deliver your critiques of violence to us. Okay. And I have to say, I'm uncomfortable with that because there seems to be a measure of truth to it. How do you work around that?
Well, I don't necessarily try to. Paulo Freire actually talks about that. Sort of, he was, it's a while since I've read it, but, he talked about, sort of talking about domestic violence among very, very poor, sort of people, community members that he was working with in South America. And they came back with a variation of that. And it forced them to stop, as it forced you to stop, and it forced me. And it puts me in an interesting position as well. It is a powerful argument because there is a there but for the grace of God go I aspect to all of this, which I want to be very, very careful about. And part of the issue has to do with the sort of extraordinary power differentials that exist under conditions of oppression, because part of what's powerful about that critique is that the state, sort of where, in whatever context this is happening, the state is just crushing those people. There's no question about it.
Sure.
It's crushing it through the prisons, crushing through the police force, it's crushing them through, how they divide up access to property, debt relations, sort of there's the range of mechanisms of violence that a state deploys, and there's so many different forms to it. And the range of public condemnation, which is part of this legitimation that we're already talking about, sort of in the context of the Ukraine thing, this sort of sense of the justice of things. In a privilege oppression environment, the judgments invariably will come down on the side of the state. And if that invariably will get heaped on, in support of the police and against, say, the supporters of George Floyd. And of course, they're part of the reason why George Floyd dies. So those legitimating narratives are really, really powerful. And, sort of in the one thing that I do not want to do ever is to find myself aligned with those legitimating narratives, because that, for me, that's actually the heart of violence. It's in our hearts. It's in the way in which our minds are sort of kind of sociologically and economically twisted to hate certain people, sort of just in virtue of their group membership, like Canadian First Nations being the more important one for you and I, given sort of how complicit we are in the violence that's still being inflicted upon them. And so, it's a powerful challenge. And of course, as you know, I'm a pacifist too. But I do get reminded, and I do get some comfort, from the kind of thing that people like King and Gandhi said, which is, sort of they have to resist. And it's right that they resist. And the choice of violence is not a great method, but it's better than the alternative. And the strongest forms of resistance, the ones which have promise in the long term, are the nonviolent ones. Sort of, I feel a lot of compassion for, for the people who criticize me like that. Right. And at a level I agree with them. I think they're right.
But here's another twist to this, Richard. Everyone knows in some sense that the state has such force that it has, if not a strict legal monopoly on violence, an effective monopoly on violence, and it deploys violence in all kinds of ways. And
I'm not sure that's true.
Well, okay, but
It has a lot of violence.
It has a lot of violence, yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't. It's never. No state's ever exerted a monopoly of violence.
A monopoly. Okay, sure, yeah.
But it's overwhelming. It has overwhelming violence.
Okay, and I can see, like, even when you get absolutely insane, poisonous narrative, like that's why I need my AR-15 to defend me against the government.
Yeah,
That fear of the state is translated into more power for the state, right? Because all these people make money off the AR-15, and the Republican Party does great off of, and that seems to be another self-enforcing loop. That how are you going to get people out of that?
Oh yeah, I mean, in a way, we're talking about various forms of false consciousness, to use that sort of Marxist phrase, right?
Yeah, sure,
and so, but the game, again, this takes us right back to where we started, with your initial thought loop, right? Because the game depends upon the maintenance of false narratives in my mind and in your mind and in the mind of every, citizen within the state. And of course, ideally, you want it imposed upon sort of neutrals and your enemies, if you whatever you may have as well, so you want a certain kind of consciousness. And if you, as a sort of a dominant sort of population group, if you're able to get that narrative and maintain it in the population, then you win. Because what happens is, sort of poor, impoverished and oppressed white farmers in Alberta, instead of, sort of going, all right, well, the problem is actually the people are firing us, and the people who are polluting our country by sort of, dumping sort of, oil sort of, into lakes and river systems or whatever. Instead of, looking at our enemy as being the people who hire and fire us, which is the truth, because nobody else actually makes any difference. None. In terms of the conditions of the lives of what, sort of the people I'm thinking of, sort of the violent narratives, the narrative of hatred gets directed at, say, Canadian First Nations.
Sure. Yeah.
Anishinaabe or Haida or whatever, and so what happens, that's divide and conquer fundamentally, right? It's, it's pitting people who actually have a lot to gain from treating each other respectfully. You pit them against each other, and you win.
Yeah, and Jordan and I have discussed this, and part of that dynamic is I don't think that Alberta farmer really believes deep down he can challenge the corporations that are tormenting him. And as again a kind of false consciousness, he says, well, okay, I'll buy an AR-15 and arm myself against the government because that's the way I'm going to take a little bit of dignity back.
Yeah, exactly. They create a kind of a myth of dignity. This is where sort of problems of patriarchy and masculinity really sort of add a toxic element to this, right? Because sort of you also have running through all of this, not just the the narrative of the little guy, sort of establishing their dignity through, but also it's a dignity through the exercise of violence. So hyper masculinized norm. So you have a conception of masculinity that, sort of the kind of gun owners that we're talking about, because not all gun owners are like this, but the ones that we have in mind certainly are.
Well, some people need to defend themselves against bears. Yeah, sure. Yeah, some people need to defend themselves against bears. Okay, sure.
Right. Sort of it makes sense, for instance, to let, people are doing sort of, field trips in the Arctic, have a rifle in case a polar bear shows up, because he'll eat you. Right.
Okay.
But anyway, leave that aside.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, yes. So masculinity is sort of playing a role, right? And so that we're wedded to things which enslave us.
Okay. So then my next question would be, and I guess it's become a theme on this podcast that I ask somebody a big hard question. Okay. Richard, what's you're king of the world now. Assume you're king of the world. And you get to take one step to unravel this system. We all want rid of this system, yet we all are in a way trapped in this system. We don't know how to get up with. What's step one?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it couldn't be done by a king.
No,
so it'd have to
that's
abolish
true.
the kingdom.
Yes. Okay. So your first step would be to abolish yourself.
Yeah, it would be actually, as a role, not as a person, of course.
Yeah.
Because I matter, we all matter. But, there's a really wonderful essay. I don't know if you've read it by Judith Butler, but called The Claim of Nonviolence. You ever come across that one?
No. I'll look it up.
Yeah, it's in a collection of essays that's the frames of war, when's life grievable. But, I think it's really, really powerful and important. And it really, it's been inspiring for me in thinking about this problem, of how do you stop this? One of the things that she does in the course of the essay is she's asking us to think about identity formation, what makes me? But she says, there are two ways in which we look at evil, both are legitimate. One is, what you could call the evil of external actors, the horrible things that other people are doing, what the Russians are doing, sort of invading Ukraine, sort of what the Canadian government's doing to the Wet'suwet'ens vis-a-vis the RCMP right now. It's lots and lots of examples, as you know. And of course, that matters. And we have to be aware of it. We have to try and imagine ways to sort of engage with it. But the issue is nonviolence, sort of engaging with these things nonviolently. And so the other pyramid of this that we have to take very, very seriously, and I think this is a hard and a profound one, is I have to look at the violence that makes me. And this also ties us back to that loop. Because, and by the way, I've seen this practically because I do, I've done a lot and continue to do practical anti-racism work, especially with respect to First Nations here. And I still try and support people at home as much as I can. And so the problem is, that sort of, I've been taught every sort of anti-First Nations prejudice you can imagine. I've been taught every homophobic prejudice you can imagine. You grew up in Eastern Canada too. You know what it's like.
Yeah, I went to high school.
Yeah, exactly. You had your own versions of it. And that's a massive informal education, which continues all the time. It never stops, And so, why does this matter? Well, we've got all this messaging, which is, like in the Ukraine case, it's disposing us, it's teaching us to be violent. One of the problems I've noted in dealing with some of my peers who try to also do anti-racism work or try to work in support of First Nations, just as an example, is they're awesome at the theory. Wow, they know it and can quote it inside out. But sort of they get, sort of in private conversations, other, First Nations friends of mine talk about how racist they are. Right. So they know all the intersectionality. They know all the, the racial theory. They, they sort of, they get it. They know the history even, they say the right things. But the one thing they can't actually do is cede power. Which is the game. And so there's my key. That's my abolish myself point, right? Ultimately, we have to find ways to share power.
I can see, if I go back to the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus says, "Resist not evil," and you read that and you go, "Well, that's crazy," but then you realize, well, no. If you offer a certain kind of resistance to evil, you get implicated into that same evil, and that's what I think that says.
You become it, right?
Yeah, you become it. And so, actually, that's not the dumbest thing ever said. That's the smartest thing ever said.
It's a lot more profound, but you got to read it carefully.
Yeah, you got to read it carefully. So I can make that determination for myself. Like I can decide, well, I'm going to, identify in myself, why do I have these tendencies to, fantasize about violence or inflict violence or whatever it is that I do, whatever it is that I'm struggling with morally. Okay.
Yeah.
And I find it hard to take the next step and call up President Zelensky and say, President Zelensky, I've discovered nonviolence. You should too, right? Because, and I'll tell you exactly why. Okay? I can imagine, I'm not good at imagining things, but I can, imagine some things. I can imagine, a nation run by Gandhian principles, right? And this would be a nation that would not be passive in the face of horrendous injustice, right? would not be passive in the face of a whole bunch of Russian people coming into your country and saying Ukrainians aren't a real people. They're quote unquote toilet Russians, because that's apparently the phrase. It's unbelievable. Okay. I can imagine a nation that is structured to use nonviolent techniques of resistance against that kind of force. Okay.
Right.
But unfortunately, if your nation is structured the other way, which, I mean, there's not very many nations on earth that aren't structured that way. I didn't want to get down to particular cases, but what do I tell that guy? Right.
Well,
so in other words,
hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I mean, in other words, I can understand myself as a nonviolent person, but then when I go to talk to others, I don't want to impose that pacifism on them if they are not, ready and like institutionally, structurally ready to embrace that kind of response.
Yeah. I don't think you can oppose pacifism.
No,
it's impossible, right?
Sure.
Sort of like, but I mean, and I don't think, sort of discussions of the possibilities, the arguments about it could be in position, because people can just walk, and most people are just going to walk away from it. But let's flip it on our head, right? So, sort of, we're part of a cluster of communities that are sympathetic to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you poke around the world, you'll find out that that's, that cluster actually tends to seems to be circling around, the liberal democracies, the countries which are opposed to, sort of the Russian invasion. But there's a cluster of other countries that are neutrals about it and highly suspicious of NATO. And so they're looking at the same set of events in a very, very different way. And of course, the question about the legitimacy of the different interpretations we can put aside. But they're seeing it a very different way. Then there's another group of nations which are on Russia's side and see Russia as the little guy.
Of course.
Now, why do I want to mention this? Well, I want to flip to one of my favorite historical actors in pacifism, which is Franz Jaegerstetter, who you may know of.
No, I don't actually. Why don't you tell our listeners about him? No,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, do a search, and I haven't seen the movie yet, but apparently there was a movie done about him a couple of years ago, which I'm just desperate to see. All right, so Jaegerstetter was an Austrian soldier in World War II who was a devout Catholic, and he decided that that Hitler's war was wrong, that Austria should not be involved, and he decided to openly and publicly criticize the war and the war effort. And so, of course, he was arrested, as Sophie Scholl and the White Rose were. And, of course, so that part of the story, of course, follows a pretty standard narrative, sort of great courage, and sort of what people normally do is they look at, well, the Nazis were terrible, he's resisting the Nazis, thumbs up for Jaegerstetter, right? Just like with White Rose and all, who are also wonderful. What's interesting to me was a debate he got into with his Catholic bishop. Because the Catholic bishop was trying to get him to stop his pacifism. Mm-hmm. And the reason he was trying to get him to stop his pacifism is the Catholic bishop's take on the Nazi war was that the Nazis were however awful they were the only bulwark against atheistic Soviet communism.
Of course, yeah.
And so Jaegerstetter was in the wrong. Right. And so Jaegerstetter was actually being immoral.
Sure.
And so one of the problems is that except in the mind of God, if there's a God, all right, I'm agnostic, so it doesn't matter to me how we resolve that. But regardless, whether you believe in a God or not, if you don't believe in a God, then you've just got a variety of different plays, which are basically defined by power relations. Actually, I don't want to hold that. But anyway, that's one way people think about it. Sort of, and so, there's just, what the Russians think, and they always believe in their own legitimacy. I think empirically that's true.
Yeah.
And then you've got what sort of the Ukrainians and the NATO people think, and their beliefs in their own legitimacy, and power is going to sort it out. If you do have a God, then the same thing holds, except the only person who actually knows anybody's intentions is God. Either way, for those of us who actually live in the world, the one thing we cannot do is settle the legitimacy of our own commitments to the fight. Not in any way where we could actually show that they would be true, in a non-question begging way, where it wouldn't be open to neutrals, or say in this case to Russians, to say, well, actually, here's what you're really doing, and here's what you really believe.
So what you seem to be
go ahead.
What you seem to be describing there, Richard, is, well, okay, we don't have access to God, so, well, let's create some kind of tribunal where, like, the Russians go, well, we're really worried about NATO expansion. And the Ukrainians go, well, we're really worried about Russia. And then somebody mediates that dispute. Now, we have tried to create institutions like that, Richard, with the UN and so on, and the League of Nations, and they don't seem to work.
Yeah. And part of the reason they don't seem to work goes to the heart of the problem, right? Like, I've just started reading, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I've started with the addendum on genocide because, I'm interested in sort of Canada's role in genocide, and sort of the extent to which we continue to perpetrate it. And one of the things which is very, very powerfully articulated in the document is that, at the first writing of the Genocide Convention, the one thing that the US and Canada and the UK and a place like Australia as well, were dead keen to make sure was that concepts of cultural genocide were not permitted to be included in the Genocide Convention, even though Lemkin, in part, he actually had the genocides against the First Nations, as a major consideration in developing the concept of genocide in the first place. And also, in spite of the really obvious objection that genocide's not about physical bodies, it's about the elimination of group identities. So it doesn't matter whether you use a mass murder technique like the Holocaust did, or whatever. But anyway, why does that matter? Well, the problem is that the institutions, the structure of the international law and the structure of the institutions itself reflects the interests of certain really key dominant players, and that undermines their legitimacy for everybody else.
So we have competing claims of legitimacy where, Russia says you're threatening us, and Ukraine says, no, they're threatening us, and NATO says you're okay, right? And then we try to create institutions to mediate those sorts of disputes, but then those institutions get captured by the very same interests, right? So we have the Security Council, the one with the 5 nations. That's the general one. The special.
The UN one. Yeah.
And of course, that's not a mediating institution. No. That's not a tribunal because it's composed of the combatants.
That's right.
And they lobby and they. So,
well, they don't even lobby; they just win.
They just win, right? They just win. Yeah. Okay, they got a veto, and okay.
Yeah.
That's the point, Richard, where I throw up my hands.
Yeah.
But I can't throw up my hands, can I?
No, we don't have any choice but to respond.
No.
Yeah, and so that's why there's for me, the question of nonviolence is so foundational. And it's not made irrelevant or vacuous by the fact that such a large chunk of practice is so violent, right? In fact, I think it's made more important because, we talked, this was in our, Facebook exchange the other day, sort of one of the reasons I made the comment that actually there's lots and lots of resistance actions. And really what I mean by those are nonviolence actions. In fact, they're common, but, they're always fragile. They're always threatened, sort of by the things that we're talking about. But, those fragile actions, they'll be happening in Ukraine right now. They're happening in Russia right now. All of that resistance, all of that protest, a very, very brave protest, was people saying there's another way, right?
Can I say something right now, of a personal nature? I don't know if you know this, but my daughter is in Russia.
Oh, no, I didn't.
Yes, she is. And she is married to a Russian citizen. And he is horrified and he is terrified. And he wants to get out. He's trying to get out of Russia. But of course, you know, he's at the back of the queue because he's a Russian national. He's kind of like like right in the bosom of my family. I have an enemy national. Right? And
yet he's not an enemy for you.
Yeah, and like the attitude of the Russian people to this is complex. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
And it depends. It depends in considerable measure on the generation. Okay. Younger people with access to knowledge, with access to the internet, and younger people who, by the way, are stakeholders in the conflict because they're the one. You know, if they're young men, they're the ones. They're the ones getting sent there, right? You know, my son-in-law is terrified someone's going to grab him on the subway and stick a helmet on his head because that could happen to him, right? He avoids the subway. So maybe there's some hope in that. I don't know. But of course, like the older generation, you know, a lot of the attitude is, well, you know, Putin's in charge. I guess he must know what he's doing. I don't know.
Yeah. Right? And there's a lot of propaganda effort being expended.
And there's a lot of propaganda. And only a certain class of people in Russia and only a certain generation of people in Russia have access to information that's not state generated.
Yeah.
And that's a large part of the problem there. You don't have to know Russian people very long to know that they're not particularly into war. Okay?
No, that's right.
However much their governments might be into war, they think it's all bullshit. And and of course, throughout this conflict, you've been seeing all these acts of resistance, of kind of, you know, stubborn, passive resistance from Russian soldiers. Go march in that village and blow it up. Oh no, I hurt my foot. Oh damn, I can't do it. Someone else has to do it, right?
Yeah, tank runs out of gas.
Tank runs. Oh no, the gasket broke on that, right? And of course you break the gasket, right?
Yeah.
That's not enough to stop a war.
No.
Because it's always going to. It's not, because there's always going to be someone who, you know, well, they don't have sergeants in the Russian army, but they have someone with a literal gun to your head saying, go in that village or I'll shoot you. Right? And do X in that village or I'll shoot you, because that's the kind of violence it's down to. But you have a people there who they're not warlike. They do the celebrations of what Victory Day or whatever, and they do all the patriotic stuff. But deep in their heart of hearts, they just want to live their lives. Okay? But you know, I guess I don't want to comment too much on Russia because I've never been there. But it's a kind of peasant stubbornness, but not allied with any sense that you can actually change things.
No, indeed.
And so you drink vodka because what the hell can you do? There's nothing I can do about this, right? I've been trained to passivity by, you know, centuries of, you know, serfdom or whatever, right? There's something to energize there. And I think there's something to energize in other countries as well, right? And if I knew how to energize that, or if someone knew how to energize that, you know, we would have a transformed situation.
I just want to say though that it's always being energized. You know, the question is whether you can coordinate it. Because, you know, peacemaking is going on all the time. And, you know, there's so much I didn't like about the Archbishop's piece, by the way. I thought it was very crude. You know, but you know, the characterization of human beings is basically conflictual. You know, the idea of peace about sort of negotiation of conflict. You know, as the nonviolent negotiation of conflict is such a shallow, it's not false, but it's shallow false, but because,
it's not,
you know, there's actually there's no agape in it. You know, oddly, you know, for an archbishop, you know, there's no sense that sort of actually, you know, sort of, it's a fundamental part of real human life. You know, that sort of a huge amount of what we do actually is not about conflict. You know, it's mostly cooperative, but you know, under conditions of oppression, of course, it's a lot harder to, you know, to successfully cooperate in ways which promote each other's flourishing. And so what happens, we have, under capitalism, we just have these very, very brutal modes of social organization, which acts against some pretty fundamental human tendencies, in my view, but they still express themselves because they have to, and so an awful lot of work has to go into making us hate each other, whether in Russia or whether in Canada, doesn't matter, and we're watching that happen, and but the one thing I'm not worried about is the energy there. It's going on all the time. I see it all around me. What breaks my heart is seeing all of the violence deployed to make sure it doesn't express, to try and make sure it expresses itself as minimally as possible. But you can't have capitalism if that stuff actually functions as it should. Nobody would do to each other the kinds of things we do, say in aged care. It just wouldn't happen. And everybody knows.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Can I tell you a hopeful story?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Go for it.
In St. Petersburg, there's this 95-year-old babushka who, survived the siege of Leningrad, and every day she goes out with a peace sign. Okay?
Awesome.
And the cops come and talk to her. They say, well, you're violating this law and you're violating that law. And she says, arrest me. But nobody's going to arrest, like a Russian is going to do that. Not going to arrest a babushka. Right? Yeah. Because she's kind of untouchable, right? Yeah. And so even in that kind of brutal environment, there's a line nobody's going to cross. Nobody's going to haul off a 95-year-old grandma who survived the siege of Leningrad to jail. Yeah. And so she has a kind of impunity. Okay? Yeah. And now if you're younger, you don't have that. Okay, right. Like if you're somebody my son-in-law's age, and like if he goes out in the street with the sign, like they'll take him to jail. They'll like knock him about for 3 days and send him home. Okay?
Well, there's tens of thousands of people in jail because they did exactly that. Yeah,
because they did exactly that. Okay.
Yeah.
So there are lines that we won't cross as human beings unless we're really forced to, right? Yeah. Those cops don't want to arrest a grandma.
Most of them.
Most of them. Well, some of them might. I don't know. Like some of them
but
might.
They won't. They won't because they'll judge the political cost of doing it is too high.
Yeah.
But if that calculus changes, they will.
If that calculus changes, somebody will say, you arrest that grandma or you lose your job and your pension and all this thing and go starve, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, but just spontaneously, the cops won't do it.
No.
No.
Yeah. Nobody wants to do that.
Nobody wants to do that, right?
You really have to break a human being to make them want to behave like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's an unbroken bit of humanity there.
Yep.
And so, however dark, and like you're kind of right. I mean, Archbishop Williams is kind of, he's dealing with the question in a political framework that, well, we're going to assume conflict and how do we manage conflict? Okay. And of course, the problem is with that, well, okay, you're going to have to make systematic appeals to their self-interest. Okay. So like Kant's Perpetual Peace or something. No, if we all make peace, we'll make more money. Okay.
Yeah.
But you're right. That's there may be something else. Yeah. I mean, it's a non-starter. Yeah. Because Raytheon's doing great now. Okay?
Yeah, in fact, they do better. They depend on there not being peace.
They depend on there not being peace. Okay,
can't sell any weapons.
And they can't sell many weapons. Okay, so there's the profiteering motive is always going to be at play. Okay, but maybe you're right that the Archbishop should go back to his guy. He should stop being a politician there. Right. Although, if you're Archbishop of Canterbury, you end up being a politician. Right?
Oh, sure. Of course you do. Yeah.
And like, I'm not even blaming him for that because, he's a smart man. He's an honest man. But if you're Archbishop of Canterbury, you're a politician and you're mediating all these factions and, But
no, my objection to the Archbishop is not about his character. It's
No.
that the arguments are internally incoherent, which is a different problem.
Yeah, it's a different problem. But so there's that something else to work with in humanity. Okay, that notion that I may beat a guy over the head with my baton, but I'm not going to beat a grandma over the head with my baton. Right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think we have to start with those basic human feelings.
Yeah. And I think for most of us, they're real.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yep.
And so we at least have some place to start lobbying from.
Yeah.
Okay? If you want it, right? So we don't have to start with a kind of dark Hobbesian view of human nature where like we just assume conflict and violence is a kind of norm, and then we try to manage it somehow, right? So it's okay.
Hobbes is crude.
Hobbes is crude, but I have students who like Hobbes, by the way.
Oh yeah, I know. And there are philosophers who love Hobbes.
Yes, there are.
They call themselves realists.
So that's a bit of hope. Is that a bit of hope, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is reason for hope. Optimism's too strong, but there's there are basic forces in human beings. Now, I want to sort of put a strong dose of caution around that hope because of Butler, and her point about identity formation, right? Because sort of the 95-year-old grandmother who shares our ethnicity, we don't touch, but darken her skin color and we smash her to bits.
Sure, absolutely.
We leave her sort of to starve on the street, right? Sort of make her LGBTQ and open about it. And suddenly, in fact, when I was working in aged care as a bioethicist, I came across this, right? So you'd have staff, sort of they get told that this 90-year-old guy who was misbehaving, due to mild dementia, was a World War II vet, and suddenly there was a halo around him. But then, and this is a real problem. This is a thing that really happened. There was another guy who was roughly the same age, but Anishinaabe, with the same condition. He was misbehaving, and they treated him like shit. And the difference was race, right? Yeah. And so the genuine human feeling comes out as it should, but in the first case, it's released for a bad reason, which is who cares? Sort of the person's just entitled, sort of to be understood, to be respected, to have their dementia recognized as a causal feature of their illness. And whether someone's a veteran or not is just irrelevant from a moral point of view. And so, sort of, although I'm very, very glad that once that some reason happened why that, which motivated their feelings of sympathy for him. But in the other case, sort of it worked in the opposite way, just because of a projection, on the basis of, their judgments about what it meant to be First Nations, right?
Sure.
And so, that's why the fundamental goal is we got to get people to become self-critical.
Yeah.
And then we will really, and people do, so there's genuine hope. People do become self-critical, but it takes a lot of courage, and it's not an easy thing to do. Because it's about not seeing myself as a good guy.
Yeah.
Right?
So what it sounds like you're saying is that for, say, comprehensive peace or comprehensive disarmament to go forward, we need a certain kind of aware or self-critical citizen who is able to say, A, I have these warm feelings about grandmas, okay?
Yep.
And then is able to say, B, that feeling should be expansive, not contractive, okay?
Yeah.
And if I go back to medieval philosophy, that's the distinction between, natural love and charity, right? Charity takes that natural goodness and expands it, right? As opposed to contracting it. So it's no longer a friend-enemy dynamic. It's no longer an inside-outside dynamic. You have somebody who is able to frame their relationships to others in a way that's not related to in-group, out-group identities.
Right.
Right.
But
That's
also
a tough
that
one.
too, yeah, it is. But also, which navigates unjust distributions of power.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is hard. There's no question
Yeah.
about it.
And like,
Sort of, I can feel very dispirited for the reason I mentioned. Watching people who genuinely know the theory, right?
Sure.
And
I've
somehow
had this
don't navigate it.
I've had this conversation with quote unquote Christian nationalists where I challenge someone to say, well, where in the Gospels does Jesus say to love people in your own country more than other countries? Yeah. And they were like, well, of course he says that. It's like, well, where? Well, I don't know where. Of course he says that, right? Of course Jesus was a patriotic, whatever he was supposed to be, right? So when you're dealing with that level of, just sheer dissonance, where do you even start?
No, agreed. But in some ways, I'm less worried about them. I'm more worried about your middle class, what King, letter from Birmingham jail, your middle class white person who's highly educated, who's done their philosophy degree, done their sociology, and can't recognize that it's just not just a matter of being able to quote theory, but also to see how you are concretely entangled in benefiting from the things that you can, sort of articulate the verbal critique of, and so that you won't actually change. Sure. Right. And so, I'd be a good example, right? So I got an associate professorship. If I'm working with, any marginalized group where what they need depends upon me, sort of yielding power in some way. And there are lots of ways in which you can yield power, but if I can't, if I can't find a way to yield power or to take a risk of ceding power, in solidarity with them, then, sort of what happens, by the way, is I look great, right? Everybody sees me as a progressive. Sure. I publish my articles, I get my promotions, maybe I win a grant. And I just keep moving forward, thinking I'm doing all this wonderful stuff when in fact I'm actually just King's white liberal.
Right.
Holding up the game.
Yeah. Because what your activism then becomes is a form of middle class careerism.
Correct. And I see it, right? I've seen it really concretely in behavior of colleagues, and it's that I find way more heartbreaking than the individuals, the Christian nationalists that you're describing. Who's got a kind of there's a different kind of naivety, about that individual, which I kind of feel for, even though it's not good.
I know. And, you kind of don't want to beat up on naive people.
No.
But
still dangerous.
It's still dangerous. I mean, they're very dangerous. And
right there.
Look, I'm not a clergy person. So in a sense, I'm lucky. I don't have to take that person aside and say, well, look, words like Catholic mean universal, right? They don't mean America or Canada, right? They don't. Right, So like, because I'll tell you what, there's so many reasons I'm glad I'm not a clergyman, Richard, because if I were, I'd get up there and I'd deliver that sermon and half my congregation would walk out.
Or you'd be a liberationist and most of your peers would abandon you.
Your peers would abandon you. And how are we for time, Jordan?
We're coming upon the hour.
We are? Okay. Do you want to interject with something, Jordan?
Oh, this has just been a great conversation. I definitely think that the most interesting thing that came out of just this dialogue today was, well, for me just now, was the thing about these forms of discourse being apologetics for just ingrained structures of power. So I really appreciate that. It's pretty terrifying, actually.
Yeah, and there's so many ways, Jordan, that you can follow this, right? Sort of, Bernie mentioned the issue about sort of resistance in Russia, and the complexity of Russian populations. But if you watch how Russians are being depicted, by and large, are being depicted as rapists, so we're just sort of basically sort of smashing everything. And there's, and that always happens. There's a really great propaganda theorist named Sam Keen, and he talks about the necessity in conflicts, in oppression generally, of building up a hostile image of the enemy in the minds of the people doing the fighting, and so propaganda is always for the home audience, whoever it is. And the point of it is to stoke hate, because you can't overcome these basically pro-social, wonderful energies that Bernie mentioned if you can't find ways to awaken fear, in that population, of awaken the sense of the justice of, whatever violence, whatever means necessary, in order to sort of put a stop to whatever it is that they really are doing, and maybe allegedly are doing too, because of course, truth is a casualty in all of this.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. So are we good, Jordan?
I suppose we are.
Unless you have a closing statement you want to make, Richard?
No, it's good. That felt like it took 2 minutes. It felt like 2 minutes long.
Sure. Okay.
Well, it seems like the theme today has been, like you said, Richard, hope and not optimism, which is, it's good to caution that optimism again, like you said. So we really appreciate your time with that.
Yeah.
People need to realize that hope's rational.
Quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah.
That's fabulous. So
awesome.
Thanks so much, Richard, for your time. And we know it's a little later there than here, and we have a beautiful sunny day here, and I'm sure that's not quite so there. I guess
we say good night to Richard.
So we say good night to our first international guest. Thank you again. I'll just plug your book one more time. We have The Absolute Violation: Why Torture Must Be Prohibited. So check that out, and thank you so much again, Richard.
Bye. I appreciate it, and really, really enjoyed this. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Yeah.
Look after yourselves.
Excellent.
All right, great.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.